Hello everybody, my name is Cameron Lopez, and today I will be doing a presentation on Langston Hughes, who I believe to be one of the most influential African American poets ever to live. I would like to start off this presentation by telling you a little bit about how African American literature relates to the African American culture. African American literature, much like any other literature from any time period or any country, is a representation of what it was like to live in that time period or in that country. The same goes for African American literature in the United States. African American literature primarily focused on the themes that were interesting to African American people of this time period. These themes would often include many good things, such as their culture and religion, but it also included many bad things as well, such as the copious amounts of racism they received on a daily basis, the inescapable feeling of slavery, the lack of freedom, and the inequality that they felt on a daily basis. This focus can be seen even as early as the 19th century stories, with people writing stories about slaves, and even up to the modern day authors. As I said before, this presentation is going to be on Langston Hughes, or James Mercer Langston Hughes, if we go by his full name. Hughes was born on February 1st, 1902 in Joplin, Missouri. He then died on May 22nd, 1967 in New York, of pancreatic cancer. Langston Hughes was primarily raised by his grandmother, as his mother would hop back and forth state to state trying to find a job to get money for her and her child. His father, however, lived in Mexico, as his mother and father quickly divorced after Langston Hughes was born. But you may know him as being an American writer, as well as a vital figure in the Harlem Renaissance. His works often depicted African American experiences. The reason why I chose Langston Hughes from other poets is that he was unlike other poets. Other poets, such as that of Claude McKay, Jean Toomer, and Countee Cullen, often didn't differentiate between their normal experiences and the experiences of the common black in America. And he didn't like to differentiate. He wanted his experiences to feel real and to not exclude him from being a common black in America. His stories had a way of making people feel reflected in their culture, in both the suffering and for their love of music and for their love of laughter and for the love of the language and the culture in which they came from. One poem that I think embodies Langston Hughes' true beliefs in a time of racial inequality would be I Too. I Too is a free verse poem, and it reads, I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen. Then, besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I, too, am America. As I read through Langston Hughes' I Too, I felt as though this is Langston Hughes' way of expressing his feelings of being forgotten in a society such as America, one that is racially biased toward that of the white man. I also wanted to point out the repetition of the portion, I too sing America. By this section, he is making the comparison between the black man and the white man. The comparison that Hughes is making is that no man is different from one another, especially based on the color of their skin. No African American man is greater than a white man. They should be equal. Langston Hughes also refers to being sent to the kitchen when company comes, or specifically, they send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. This is a nod to the life of segregation. During the times of slavery, and even after slavery was abolished, many African Americans still worked for the richer white Americans. They would do many things around the house, such as taking care of the children, preparing dinner, cleaning the house, and as well as outside work, such as tending the crops, maintaining the yard, and things of that nature. But in this specific instant, Langston is referring to the time in which African Americans would be told to go out of sight when company came to the rich white American's house. They were expected to be servants to the white Americans that came. It was them who were to wait on the people that came over, whether that be getting them drinks, making them food, getting them food, and serving them. In times of slavery, they worked for no money at all, and even times after slavery was abolished, these people worked for very low. During slavery, they didn't work for anything at all, but after slavery was abolished, their wages were still very low compared to the average white American. And not to mention, they were unable to get jobs very easily as well. As I was doing research on Langston Hughes, I found many connections to what I had learned in American ethnic studies, the first being his connection to the civil rights movement. Langston Hughes was around 50 years old by the time the civil rights movement started, and by this time he had a lot of time to write a number of poems, many of them dealing with the subject of dreams or being in a dream or dreaming larger than life. At the time, he wrote these poems as a reflection of the struggle that all the African Americans were facing during this time of cultural racism. But what you may not have known is that these poems actually inspired Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. is one of the most memorable leaders of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. stood for the average African American man. He believed that they could be more than what they were told by the white Americans. The most memorable speech that Martin Luther King Jr. ever made was the I Have a Dream speech. In this speech, Dr. King uses the aspects of dreams repeated over and over again to state a point that he was trying to make. But what I did not know until I was researching Langston Hughes was that Martin Luther King Jr. was very much inspired by Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes had so much so that Hughes's poetry hovers behind Martin Luther King's sermons like watermarks on bonded paper, according to scholar W.J. Miller in a post from the Florida Bookshelf. And by saying this, scholar W.J. Miller was saying that in every single speech that Martin Luther King Jr. did, you could hear a tiny bit of Hughes's influence, whether it be dreams, like I said before, in the I Have a Dream speech. The other obvious thing that I can see when you talk about Langston Hughes and in relation to American ethnic studies is the issue of racism. As I have mentioned before, Langston Hughes grew up in a time of very heavy racial inequality. And as a result, his poems often share the themes of hopes, racial equality, and the longing for a better future. He was trying to link his writing to the struggles that he had felt, as well as many other African Americans in this time period. In 1926, Langston Hughes wrote an essay called The Negro and the Racial Mountain. In it, Hughes says, "I want to be a poet, not a Negro poet," as well as, "And I was sorry the young man said that, for no great poet has ever been afraid of being himself. This is the mountain standing in the way of any true Negro art in America. This urge within the race toward whiteness, the desire to pour racial individuality into the mold of American standardization, and to be as little Negro and as much American as possible." I believe by writing these out, he is saying that many of the African American influencers and artists of this time period wanted to be as little Negro as they could. This would mean that they would stray away from their culture in hopes that the white American would accept them and accept their work, when in reality, Langston Hughes is saying that we should do the complete opposite, that you should be proud of where you come from and the culture that you were brought up in. And I believe that the analogy of calling it a mountain standing in the way is very fitting. As a mountain, you have to do little increments at a time. You can't just do one big step over it. It's just the little tiny baby steps that get you over this mountain. And I believe that Langston Hughes was starting that for many African American artists of this time period. And the last relation that I saw about Langston Hughes relating to American ethnic studies was Jim Crow laws. As you can imagine, Langston Hughes was very opposed to Jim Crow laws as they enforce segregation. By the many different examples that I have told you, you can see how Langston Hughes didn't believe in the idea of segregation. He wanted everybody to be treated equally for who they are and what they could bring to the table. I did find a story about Langston Hughes back in 1914. He had gotten very angry with his 7th grade teacher when the teacher moved him and other African American students into a separate row in the classroom. To combat this, he put Jim Crow row on the cards and put them on the black kids' desks. This ultimately got him expelled, as you could imagine. But thanks to the parents that rose up, he was eventually allowed back in the school. This is only one instance in when he fought back, and he won a victory for the African American students. He made it so that separate seating was no longer allowed in his school. And lastly, I just wanted to tell you about the impact of Langston Hughes. Like I mentioned before, in The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, Langston Hughes wanted to make sure that every young Negro artist was able to understand that they had more to bring than just the color of their skin, that they were capable of achieving just as much or even greater than the average white American. And I believe the quote, "We younger Negro artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame," exactly embodies what I had talked about. Langston Hughes also wasn't afraid to cross racial boundaries, especially in a time where it was hostile, and times where they were segregated, and times when he wasn't heard by many other people. and due to this impact, I believe that he earned a well-deserved spot in the history of literature, especially that of African American literature. Thank you.